Good afternoon, everybody. This is Pastor Ty here with our sermon recap from last week. We covered Mark chapter 8, starting at verse 27, ran all the way through the end of Mark 8, and then covered Mark chapter 9, verse 1 as well. And so that's what we're going to be recapping today, the sermon that we titled See and Hear the King. And of course, that kind of flows in with the title of the year-long sermon series we're doing through the Gospel of Mark called King and Kingdom. And so the big moment in the gospel narrative at the end of Mark 8 is the moment where Jesus is on the road through the villages of Caesarea Philippi with his disciples. And he stops and he asks his disciples, who do people say that I am? And they give the same list of supposed characters from previously in Mark and throughout Mark. And Jesus pivots and asks the disciples, but who do you say that I am? And we have this incredible moment where Peter is the first person to vocalize what was introduced at the very beginning of Mark chapter 1 by the gospel writer Mark himself, that Jesus was indeed the Christ, the Son of God. And so I want to speak very quickly to this declaration that Peter makes, because it's wildly important. It connects the entire beginning of Mark's gospel to this apex moment here in Mark chapter 8 that sort of signifies the end of the first act, that is the Gospel of Mark. This is the apex moment where somebody speaks truthfully about who Jesus is for the first time, and it explains everything that has happened up until that point in Mark's Gospel. And I want to start here because it was the 19th century poet Heinrich Heine who when he was speaking about why Catholic cathedrals stopped being made, said the following: "The men of old times had convictions. We in the modern time have only opinions. And more than opinion is needed to raise a cathedral." And so when I hear Peter's declaration in Mark chapter 8, what I believe we're seeing in the text is not just an opinion, it's a conviction. It comes from something deeper and more profound than just, this is what I think about you. Peter was given revelation as to who Jesus Christ is and was in the text, and he declares it in this moment. And in so doing, it serves as the pinnacle moment of Mark's gospel's first half. Peter has rightly identified and communicated who Jesus is. And so every teaching of Jesus, every healing of Jesus, every exorcism of Jesus, every sign and wonder, every confrontation he's had with the religious elite comes to a head at this moment where Peter's conviction causes him to speak rightly about who Jesus is. His title is rightfully Messiah and Christ, the Anointed One. And that's very important, because that's a very loaded statement that Peter has made. And while Peter is right to call Jesus the Christ, right to identify him as Messiah, Jesus is going to begin a program of helping the disciples understand what that actually means. So it's not just that they have the title right. Now they need to have a correct understanding of the program behind this messianic title that they've just asserted to Jesus. And so it was it's the scholar Michael Card who put it this way: Jesus sets out to undeceive the 12. And so the best way to kind of understand what that means is to realize that in the first century AD, the Jewish expectation of what the Messiah would be was drastically different than what Christ had come to do. And so what we find in this text today at the end of Mark 8 is one of the key points that came out of the sermon on Sunday, which is the following: Jesus didn't just challenge messianic expectation, he shattered it and redefined it. And so when Jesus accepts and receives as true the title that Peter gave him in Mark chapter 8, that he was in fact the Messiah, he was the Christ, the Anointed One of God, Jesus now immediately sets out to redefine what Messiah comes to do and to shatter all the previous expectations. Because whatever they thought the Messiah was going to be, one who would enter Jerusalem, one who would war against the nations, one who would destroy all hostile powers, one that would come to renovate Jerusalem and bring back the diaspora, one who would create a golden age that would never end for Israel, this sort of nationalistic, militaristic political figure. That's not what Jesus had come to do. In fact, what Jesus sets out to immediately present before the disciples as his messianic program was that the Messiah was going to triumph, but he was going to triumph through suffering and through rejection. In fact, Jesus states explicitly in Mark chapter 8 that the Son of Man must suffer many things, be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and then 3 days later rise again. And so Jesus is explicit. It actually says in Mark, he speaks plainly that this was the plan. And so Jesus makes a note to say, not only is suffering and rejection part of the messianic program, but it's what leads to the triumph and the glory that you always anticipated. And the real kicker was that this has always been the plan that God set out to do. This was always what Jesus expected would come from his being on the earth. And it's the disciples that are going to have to catch up to that. So what we have here at the end of Mark chapter 8 is this understanding of, we have suffering. We have suffering as the program by which Jesus is bringing forth his role as Messiah, that to suffer and be rejected is part of being the Messiah. So there's that aspect that Jesus presents, the suffering and the rejection as part of being Messiah. Then there's that misunderstanding that comes with that, especially on the account of the disciples. And then through that misunderstanding, Jesus calling and inviting the disciples and anyone else to take part in this program of the Messiah. And that gets into the next really important part, is this dichotomy between Peter's rejection of Jesus's presentation of what it means to be the Messiah, and Jesus having to rebuke Peter's misunderstanding. And then on the other hand, Jesus's open-handed, inclusive invitation for anyone to join this messianic program. And that comes to the next part of the sermon that we had at the end of Mark 8, was this understanding that to participate in Jesus is to join him in suffering and rejection in his name. And it's important to understand that, because what we're not saying and what was not preached on Sunday is this idea that our participation in Jesus's work is what saves us. No, Jesus saves us. But a part of being saved by Christ is to identify with Christ and with his life, which means that suffering and rejection is inevitable. And this is where you get so many pivotal passages in the Bible now making so much sense from the New Testament. So for instance, Matthew 7, verse 13, enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction, and those who enter it are many. But the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and few find it. So again, it's this understanding of, the road isn't what saves you. Christ saves you. But when he saves you, he puts you on this narrow path, this hard way, right? That suffering and rejection are part of the Christian call. And perhaps nobody understood this better than the Apostle Paul, who wrote in Galatians chapter 2, verse 20, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. In the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself up for me. And that part at the end there, that gave himself up for me, it's really important, because what that tells us is that what Christ invites us to do, we do in part. And what Christ invites us to do, he did to the fullest extent. So none of us will suffer and be rejected to the extent that Jesus is. And the reason we know that is because 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 21, Paul explicitly states, for our sake, God made him, Jesus, to be sin, who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. So we could never possibly experience the full suffering and rejection that Christ experienced, because that was the conduit by which we were saved. And since we don't save ourselves, since that was Christ's work on our behalf, we can only experience in part what Christ experienced in full. So that invitation to walk into the suffering and rejection of Christ is something we only receive in part. And that's important, because William Lane, the great New Testament scholar, he put it this way: Jesus stipulated that those who wish to follow him must be prepared to shift the center of gravity in their lives from a concern for self to a reckless abandon to the will of God. So it's this understanding that when Christ sacrificed himself ultimately for us, the expectation then becomes that we will join him in denying ourselves completely and walking forward with him. And the reason why this is so important is because Mark chapter 9, verse 1 speaks to this understanding that the glory of God's kingdom not only is already present on the earth, but that we're going to begin to see it more and more fully. And Jesus promises that there are those eyewitness to Jesus's words on that fateful day on the road to Caesarea Philippi who will see the glory of God's kingdom before they pass. And so Jesus is saying the kingdom is here, and you're going to begin to see the kingdom on the earth. And friends, to this day, we still do, but we're going to get a really great understanding of what kind of glory some got to see in Jesus's day. That's going to be what we cover the next Sunday. And so come back on Thursday when we do the sermon recap, and we'll begin to peel back the onion of what is this glory of the kingdom that some people got to see. So God bless you. Happy 4th of July, soon coming. We'll talk soon.